researchers at Cornell University stated that adults make an average of 35,000 decisions every day, which explains why most of us are exhausted by the end of the day. And every time we make a decision, we set a priority. For instance, if we decide to have an apple as a snack, we are prioritizing healthy, natural foods. When I decide to eat Cheetos as a snack, I prioritize comfort, salt, and cheesy goodness. Every time we ask God to help us, we make God our priority. Every time we decide to ask our friends to help us, we make our friends the priority. Every time we decide we're just going to do it ourselves, we make ourselves the priority. 35,000 times a day, we set priorities. 35,000 times a day, we decide what or who is most important in our lives. Now, Jesus was talking to the crowds about priorities on the day we just heard about in Luke's Gospel. A large crowd was traveling with Jesus, and some were traveling with him because, well, he was Jesus, and they wanted to hear what he had to say. They were curious. They wanted to learn more. They wanted to know more, and a lot of them just wanted to be healed. Most were traveling with him that day because they were all going to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. They were religious tourists who got the benefit of traveling with a rabbi whose followers insisted was the Messiah. Now, Jesus wanted those who were with him that day in the crowd to understand what he really expected from his closest followers. And Jesus had three kinds of people around him that day. The first was the crowd. The group that was there because they were curious about what Jesus had to say. So they found themselves in a place where they could travel along and catch what he was saying to people. He spoke to the crowds with teachings that everyone should hear. Now, the second group was called the followers. And followers were part of the group that traveled with Jesus most of the time. They were the spouses, the children, the friends, siblings, cousins, and others who traveled along as support teams for Jesus' closest followers. And the third group, the people closest to him, were his disciples. And his disciples were about 20 or 30 people who really wanted to learn what Jesus taught. They wanted to learn how to do what he did and how to live exactly the way he lived. Disciples were men and women who knew Jesus the best, and they had devoted their lives to following him, to becoming like Jesus, for he was their way, their truth, and their life. Jesus spoke to the crowd that day because he wanted everybody, including his disciples, to understand that following Jesus was a decision that set priorities in every other aspect of their lives. Discipleship was a commitment that put Jesus, his teachings, his actions, and his connection to God before everything else. So when Jesus told the crowd that those who truly wanted to be his disciple must hate their families, he was saying that Jesus had to be their top priority. Now, hate in the first century wasn't the way we think of Packers and Bears, or Brewers and Cubs. Hate in the first century meant turning away from or detaching from. Hate meant deciding to set a priority that may not be what was socially acceptable or what other people wanted you to do. That meant if a decision had to be made between doing what your family asked you to do and what Jesus asked you to do, Jesus expected his disciples to turn away from what his family wanted and to do what he wanted. Jesus compared himself to building a tower, which in Roman times was a symbol of wealth. Wealthy families staged public battles to determine who had the most by building towers. The higher the tower, the wealthier the family, which seems remarkably Freudian to me, but that was the way people showed off their wealth in Roman times. A few of you got the joke. Now, if a family decided to build the tallest tower in town, Jesus said they had better have the money to complete it. Otherwise, if they were building it and couldn't complete it, a lot of people would take a lot of pressure in seeing the mighty and the proud fall. Aren't we somewhat the same? When somebody thinks they're just all that, and then they can't put words or put actions to their words, do we really mind? Not that much. So if a member of the crowd wanted to follow Jesus, they had best be sure they had the internal and spiritual resources to really do what Jesus did, to be willing to teach what Jesus taught and live the way he lived. Jesus compared the commitment to being his disciple with that of being a king getting ready to go into battle. Before engaging in war, the king had to be sure that they had the resources to win the battle. So if somebody in the crowd wanted to follow Jesus, they needed to make sure that they were fully committed to living with Jesus every minute of every day, learning what he learned, learning what he taught, doing what he did. Because following Jesus was going to involve battles with all of the forces arrayed against Jesus, and some of those forces were their own families. Because keep in mind, in a good Jewish family, following a self-proclaimed or even a disciple-proclaimed Messiah was darn close to blasphemy. And nobody in their family wanted their son or daughter, husband or wife, cousin or any relative to be a blasphemer, because when that happened, they were eligible for stoning. So having a family member decide to follow Jesus was really hard for families to deal with, which meant the making it priority. If you're going to follow Jesus, you better be ready to follow Jesus, because chances are your family was not going to like it. The goal in following Jesus today is the same as it was in the first century, and that is to become a disciple of Jesus. The goal is to learn what Jesus taught, live the way he lived, and do what he did. The goal is to be fully committed to living with Jesus as the guide and ruler of our lives in every minute of every day. And I suspect I'm not the only one here this morning who questions their ability to really be a true disciple of Jesus. Because let's face it, we know how to be good church members, and we like being good church members. We show up on a regular basis, we give our time, we give our talents, we step up when we need to step up, we give our gifts and our prayers and our service and our witness to the God we know through Jesus Christ, and we're pretty comfortable with that. In fact, we think being a good church member is a lot of sacrifice, that the church expects a lot from us, and that must be Jesus expecting a lot from us, but Jesus expects so much more. I suspect none of us really knows how to make listening, learning, and doing what Jesus did a priority for every moment of every day. I suspect most of us are reluctant to give all of who we are and all of what we have to following Jesus. Well, the good news is none of us has to know how to be a disciple of Jesus in the first moment we commit our lives to following him. It's kind of like marriage vows. Who really knew what they were promising to do? Who really knew everything that was going to be expected? Nobody. But it's something that, like marriage, we live into as disciples. In fact, look at all the times Jesus looked at those who followed him most closely and said, "How can you not get this? How can you be so thick-headed? What is wrong with you?" Not that anybody would ever say that to their spouse, but the day we commit our lives to following Jesus, who we are and what we have, to following him, God goes to work on us. And the day we say, "Yes, Jesus, I want to follow you," our hearts, our minds, and our souls become open to being a real disciple. We have the opportunity and the desire to have God change us from the inside out. The day we tell Jesus we want to make him, his way of life, and his teachings the top priority in our lives is the day that we begin to change. And for once we decide to make living, learning, and doing what Jesus did our top priority, every other priority in our lives begins to shift. Now, our families, spouses, children, grandchildren, all of those relatives are still incredibly important to us. That doesn't change. But we begin to realize that they're not really ours. All of the people around us belong to God, and God cares for those folks even more than we do. Our work may still be really important to us, but our work, instead of a job where we make a living, becomes a ministry. Something that we do in service to God, God's people, and God's creation. Our friends are still really important to us, but we become more open to expressing our faith in our attitudes, in our actions, and even our words. Our conversation, our entertainment, our hopes, and our choices will be governed by our connection to Jesus. And when we decide to be a disciple of Jesus, our priorities are put into perspective. We discover that we become willing to live and die for our faith and for our connection to the God we know through Jesus our Christ. We become ready to sacrifice for the well-being of God's people and God's creation. How we live, what we do, how we work and play, our connection to our families and friends are affected by making Jesus our top priority. Following Jesus and being a disciple of Jesus is probably the hardest, most terrifying, happiest, and most exciting thing we will ever do in life. But it's worth every bit of effort, every sacrifice, and even the occasional detachment, where we have to look at somebody who wants to be first in our lives, and in a way that reflects our love of Jesus, says, "You are so important to me, but I need to do this right now. I care about you so much, but I need to be here right now." And the good news is that most of us don't become disciples overnight. It's a process, where once we say yes, God starts stirring in the ingredients, until one day we discover that we are the people that God has created us to be. And the reward of becoming a disciple of Jesus is growing closer to that peace, joy, love, and hope that only He can provide. All we have to do is tell Jesus we want to be one of His disciples. We want to make following Jesus, learning from Him, and living for Him, like Him, our way of life. And for most of us, that's going to take time. So maybe the first step for us is to want to be a disciple. Say, "I'm not sure I can get engaged to this concept. I'm not sure I can take the vows, but you know what? I can tell God I want this. I want to make that commitment." Because as soon as we want something, we leave the Cheetos behind and actually grab the apple. As soon as we want something, God starts to change us. As soon as we want something, we begin to become transformed into the people God made us to be. Talking to Jesus about being a disciple or not is one of the 35,000 decisions each of us will make today. And it is by far the most important decision that we will make today. It's not an easy decision to make, but it is a decision that will guide the rest of our lives, because the decision to follow Jesus as one of His disciples will change every other priority in our lives in ways that make us, the people around us, and the world we live in a much happier, healthier, more whole, and closer to God kind of world. Maybe it's time to choose the apple. Amen.